Welcome back, everyone. Please now give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Senior Energy Transition Leader, Jim Barry. Jim joins us for a keynote talk on sustainability, seeing the big picture beyond today, and investing in challenging times. Jim has been a pioneer in this space for over 25 years. He was Chief Investment Officer of BlackRock's $330 billion alternative asset business and is now spearheading the development of a global insurance carrier, developing risk solutions in the energy transition space. Thank you, Jim.
I had a huge presentation prepared, spent months at it, and unfortunately with the tech issues, I just wrote out a few points. So let me start by mentioning John Mullins as well. I had the great pleasure, and sometimes not pleasure, of working with John for a few years in the first part of the decade. Unbelievably smart guy, and always high energy, huge commitment. And just fun to be around. And I have to be honest, it was with great dismay and regret I heard of his passing. I only saw him a few weeks ago, and I'm sure half the room probably only saw him a few weeks ago because that was his nature. But a real Cork man. He bled Cork, no matter where on the planet he was, and I was in a few odd corners of the planet with him. But it just would be inappropriate just not to acknowledge him and the friendship this morning. Anyway, okay, what am I going to talk about? It's one of these things which I've done quite a bit, but you kind of don't know where to start at the moment. Steve Bannon, that right-wing populist in the United States, Irish heritage as it happens, talked about in Trump 45 flooding the zone with decisions. Well, the zone is flooded and increasingly flooded with the scale and scope of decision-making coming out of the United States. I also need to preface my subsequent remarks by saying I'm actually really great crack. I really good to have on a night out. Paul, please, wherever you are, he'll give evidence to this. But it just may not come across, okay, in the next 25, 45 minutes, whatever, with Q&A. So a couple of things. You have to start with the United States. And we listen to a lot of stuff. We're so more engaged in the economy in the last 20 years than in the previous 40 years in just natural dialogue. And we talk about big events and change. But I'm telling you, the world has now changed. So the environment that the global economy and global society has operated in since Second World War has now changed. And the United States, which was the cornerstone of stability over that 80 years in a rules-based global order, is now the major source of instability. And that changes everything. And so whatever you take out of today, you just got to take out that the world is now going to be a much more volatile, uncertain space, which gets down to what decision-making you take every day in your businesses. And I think that that's one of the reasons I'm bearish on both the US economy and the global economy, is that how do you take decisions as a consumer, as a corporate entity, as an investor? How do you take decisions in this environment? And I think that people are putting their hands in their pocket and not spending. I was in Goodwood at the weekend, a mate of mine, to see him crash his car in front of 20,000 people. But he was saying that the preppers of the cars who are working for generally high net worth individuals, their business is down 20-30%. Auction prices on vintage cars, again, reflecting a certain segment of society, down 20-30%. You're getting these little stories anecdotally all over the place of it. And what's worse is you're now seeing it in data. The big consumer sentiment data in the United States that's watched and respected over a long time is the Michigan Opinion Survey. And it's showing results that haven't been seen since the global financial crisis, or even 2001 in terms of unemployment expectations. Or sorry, 1981 on unemployment expectations. And their inflation expectations in the next 12 months is 6.7%, which is a good 200 basis points higher than it was even in the peak of 23-24. So what you're beginning to see is the consequence of this decision-making volatility we're seeing out of the White House in a way that has real-world implications. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room here are exposed to the multinational world in some form or another, and you're seeing it, I'm sure, every day in the kind of just the context for indecision that's being provided. I used to, it was a great line of mine for a few years, talk about how that Brexit would be the greatest act of national self-harm, economic self-harm we would see in our lifetime. I have now got a new line. Trump 47 will be the greatest act of national self-harm, economic self-harm we will see in our lifetime. And the challenge is it will harm more than the United States in a way Brexit didn't really. It has massive global implications. And I think, and the great irony here, it's screwing the United States. So the relative decline of the United States is enhanced by Trump 47. And in a sense, that's just going to create a disruption that is negative overall for the world. The other thing I would say to you is, the other irony of all of this is it's not going to address the real issues that have driven these popular democratic expressions of Brexit and Trump, which are all around inequality, deindustrialization, because migration, what I would say trade, and also wokeism are not the causes of the issues that drove the voting for the individual and the referendum. And so, unfortunately, these issues remain and will continue to have populist expression in our democratic societies. Trump 47 is not Trump 45. Trump 45, back in what was 2016, he did not expect to win that election. He was as shocked, as surprised as anybody was that night in November. Consequently, he leaned on the GOP conventional system to get into power. He also didn't know how the system worked. And so he ended up massively constrained, surrounded by generally functional, competent administrative executives with conventional views, generally based on fact and analysis, about how to get things done. And also just, took 6-9 months to fill out the political appointees in the administration. It was just ill-prepared. This is not the case. Today, he is surrounded by a combination of incompetence, where telegenic quality is the primary criteria, or ideologues. And this is really important. Trump himself isn't really an ideologue. He has some really unconventional, really hard-held views, like on trade, like on reconstructed late 19th century perspective. But there is a right-wing Christian nationalism that surrounds him. It's there in Stephen Miller, Deputy Chief of Staff. It's Peter Navarro on trade. And a name you may or may not have heard of, but the Dark Lord himself, Russell Vought in OMB, which is effectively the check signing part of Office of Management and Budget of the federal government. He authored a report called Project 2025. ChatGPT it, if you want to know what the US administration is all about. But basically, this was produced 2 years ago, which was a right-wing nationalist, a Christian nationalist agenda for Trump 47. And the individuals who are very smart and very capable that were behind that are now surrounding Trump in the White House. And he doesn't have either the intellectual rigor or analytic competence to really understand what he's doing, but he loves the expression of power that's implicit in the policy. So what's this ideological expression? So there's a couple of dimensions to it. So the first is the destruction of the non-partisan administrative state. Now, I'm the first person, and another day I'd be giving out like hell about the public sector's efficiency and effectiveness and delivery. which politicians have been bearing the consequence of in democracies, but it's a huge issue. However, the answer is not what Trump and his administration are doing. So I'm using a vase analogy to describe this to people. So when you have a vase of flowers, and there's some flowers you like and some you don't, what you don't do is pick the vase up and toss it on the ground, and then go down and pick up the flowers you want, and then there's no vase to put them in. And that's what's going on. And what you're going to see over the course of the next 12, 18 months, 2 years, is the effective administration of the United States begin to fail. It's been driven by an ideology that says these non-partisans, this elite, bureaucratic elite, are preventing me deliver my political objectives. But fundamentally, it's going to end up, and it's been weaponized as well, but fundamentally, it's going to reduce the effectiveness of the US state. We clearly have the implementation of a Christian nationalist social agenda, which is in the papers every day. And then what you're also seeing is a material expansion of executive authority. When the United States was set up, it was about this tension between the executive, Congress, and the judiciary. There's an executive unitary theory, which again you'll see in the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, which says actually there should be no constraints on the executive authority. And that's unfortunately been enabled by the Supreme Court, who last year in July, in Trump versus the US government, basically said that a president could not be held liable for any decisions he takes in power. In other words, he or she is unconstrained in the sort of expression of their executive authority. And even on the fringes of what might be assumed as their executive authority, there is the assumption they're acting within the law. This is a big deal because as he begins to assume this office 3 months ago, he basically begins to rewrite how presidents behave. And that's combined with an assault on the other institutions of state, Congress, judiciary, and effectively civic society, the universities, cultural institutions, and the media. And I say Congress because even though Congress is controlled by the GOP and in effect are his lapdogs at one level, because the GOP, again in contrast to 4 years, is in his image, and he's shaped it in his image, he's ignoring Congress. He's doing it all by executive order. It's a fundamental assault on the power and authority, which won't get tested unless the Democrats win Congress or the House of Representatives at least back in 18 months. And clearly, immigration is the other dimension to that ideology. In addition, then, we have a few what I would call Trump flavors on top of that, particularly around trade and particularly around security, which is shaped by the sense of the United States has been a victim of the last 80 years, which is measured in a very narrow way by trade deficit and surplus. It takes no account of the fact that the global economy is now transformed, the service industry nature of a huge part of the economy, and also the massive financial benefit the United States has gained from being the dollar being the reserve currency of the world, which John touched on and I'll come back to. I think there's a couple of other dynamics that you have to take into account. One is tax, tax, and tax. Everything politically in the GOP is around extending tax breaks introduced 10 years ago, which will expire at the end of this year. It's about $2.5 trillion plus. And back to, again, John's sort of picture on the deficit, that has to be dealt with in some way. And there's only two ways. You can borrow more or you can cut expenditure. And in a sense, that plays into trade as well. The tariffs maybe help on the revenue side. But that pressure to deliver that tax extension is going to be enormous and dysfunctional in its consequences. And then finally, China, where there is bipartisan support for challenging its rise, both on an economic and security basis. And but again, back to the lack of consistency, a whole load of the initiatives undertaken by the Trump administration undermine any sort of geostrategic challenge to China. So what are the implications? Number one, this new world order that I mentioned, the breakdown in the rule-based order, of which it will be the EU, will be the sort of the bastion of hope to kind of sustain it, because not only will China welcome it, the global south and a lot of the big economies in the global south will welcome it too, whether that's India, Brazil, South Africa, et al. Might is right is now the most succinct way of describing geopolitical dynamics and trade, as in the case of what the US is attempting. We're seeing that play out, obviously, with Russia and Ukraine. We're seeing it with Israel in the Middle East. We're seeing it Rwanda and Congo. You're seeing it an element in Sudan. I mean, and you will see it with China and Taiwan. So, like, as you think about the massive shift in what it means geopolitically and geostrategically, this might is right dynamic, which with a change in administration may come back a bit, but you can never, if you're Europe as an example, count on the US security guarantee again. And if you're in Southeast Asia, what faith have you in the security guarantee for Taiwan and implicitly for those around like Japan, South Korea, etc.? So second, and John touched on this, but I would share his view, the risk of serious US recession and consequently broadly negative economics for the world is very real. I touched on the Michigan survey. The biggest issue is the uncertainty. What do you do as a consumer or as a corporate or an investor if you can't rely on the environment? You put your hands in your product and by the way, your pocket, and by the way, the risk premium, as John said, goes up materially. And that emerging market analogy is not misplaced. You've got a clientelism dynamic now to the White House, which is classic emerging market. It changes the rules of the road fundamentally. And that has implications then for how is the response, but with the inflation dimension in the mix, that classic central bank riding over the hill on the white charger to save the day isn't necessarily going to be there, which would give huge concern to the length and extent of any kind of recessionary dynamic. And then, as John again eloquently pointed out when he had slides as well to show, the deficit picture is really poor, generally speaking. It's in complete contrast to what you might expect going into a recession, which again limits flexibility. Third, advantage China. This is all good news for China in its relative competition with the United States. It will clearly, obviously, have to deal with some pain, but far greater from its perspective is the massive weakening of US influence and soft power. It has really significant economic tools to counter the United States position, whether that's on agricultural demand, whether it's on rare earth processing, whether it's specific targeting of either the services sector or US corporates. And it will be fundamentally strategic in how it responds. They have no AI disadvantage. DeepSeek put that to bed. And I do see the competition in that space being intense, but certainly but that anticipated relative weakness isn't there. And then finally, they're just laughing at the security guarantee evaporation. Certainly, if I was in Taiwan now, your only hope is a kind of Ukraine strategy, but ideally before Ukraine, which is to create such sufficient concern in the Chinese Communist Party that actually an invasion would create some long interminable conflict that ultimately with little or no near-term resolution. So what about Ireland in that context? It's tough. First of all, we're a small open economy. We've absolutely made the right strategic choice in playing that role in the global economy and doing that within the context of the EU. And we've been enormously successful. And that's obvious in the world, by the way, right? Okay, I mean, wherever you go, for the tiny nature of our economy and island and population, we're being extraordinarily visible. But we're caught on two sides with the tariffs, right? So coming from the US, pharma is at risk. Now, it's not immediate. I mean, these are 25 years decisions you make around building these facilities. So it's not like they get shut down tomorrow. But it's the next phase of decision making where that flows that will inevitably some relative allocation back to the United States. But the response from EU may get at tech, which is exposed from the US side too. But in a sense, that's one of the ways for Europe to gain real leverage over the US administration. And so we're kind of caught in the middle of that. And walking the political line around that is going to be very challenging for us. I think that, clearly a US recession will have negative economic implications here. John already touched on, let's call it the perception issue and the greater fragility in our budget position than the headline. And I think that on top of the classic challenge in terms of needing to fund a whole range of social services and other demands, we're going to have new demands like defense, where we have been, in a way that geopolitically, we have no choice, but we have to spend 4, 5, 6x what we've been spending on defense. We have been negligent at the wheel in that, and in a sense, I was talking to a great friend of mine, Adrian Jones. He's chairman of Goldman Sachs private equity business, former Irish Army officer from Tulse County, Roscommon. And we were talking about it 2 weeks ago, and he was talking to some of his friends who are now at the top of the army, and he says about this new context for investment. But he says they're so conditioned by the last 30 years, they're struggling to get their head out of what's now required for Ireland in a defence context. But in a sense, we'll have new challenges on the spending side. I also would say to you, the pressure to deal with public sector inefficiency and ineffectiveness and lack of delivery is going to build. It's been a huge driver, when you look at it, of a huge amount of populism around the place. But it's going to have to be addressed. Either it gets addressed by the conventional political system, or will it get addressed in other ways, as we're seeing Trump undertake in the United States. But certainly, there's a better way to go about than what Trump is doing, but that rises up the agenda from my perspective in a huge way. In terms of you as a business owner or service provider, whatever your particular interest is, it's time for caution. It's a volatile world with massive uncertainties and big downside risk, and so you're going to have to be very thoughtful about how and when you're deploying. You've got to scenario test your resilience to economic slowdown, to the impact of the tariffs, to the cost of your leverage in the context of any business challenge. You've got to look at your supply chain. You've got to see what the implications are directly or indirectly. Think second or third order. Paul O'Donovan and Associates I can recommend as an advisor for anyone who needs advice in this current uncertain environment. And then on sustainability, because John insisted I talk about his sustainability, don't give up on sustainability. And I'm going to get on a little hobby horse just for a second here. So the sustainability ESG movement effectively morphed from something which was shaped around thinking about risk. So ESG criteria is just a list of risk criteria. And the risk criteria, which 10, 15, 20 years ago, whether we're saying on climate as an example, but also social impact of your activities, didn't really have a cost in the short term. There was medium, long-term costs there if you weren't careful. But those costs are now much more direct and apparent, okay? And your ability, your social license to operate, the environmental impact of what you're doing, these poor governance, these all are risks with costs. And what they were great for was identifying these costs that might be in the future, which we are typically poor at, where we tend to look at what we see and can cost today. It morphed into a more value-based judgment about what was right and wrong, and it also morphed into this regulatory kind of momentum, which became massively burdensome and more about compliance than actually change. So for your business, take no comfort from the fact that the Trump administration is looking to roll back dynamics on climate and other social and other regulatory obligations, environmental, whatever. The change is there, the risks are real, and they remain for your business. And they remain for your customers, who may well continue to look for you to hit higher standards across a range of dimensions. And so, so to get away from thinking about this as a value-based judgment as to what's right or wrong, get back to thinking about this around a range of risks that are relevant to your business, which may not have the price or cost today, but will definitely have tomorrow. And as an infrastructure investor, you live with that, because if you build a piece of infrastructure which has ultimately got real social negative impacts, I'll pick something random like the Westlink, okay? Ultimately, there will come a price rise that triggers a political backlash, ultimately forces the buyout of the asset. Now, fortunately, the contract was fair, and we negotiated a reasonable transaction price. But the point being, this stuff does have cost. And so if you blow up a whole set of Aboriginal caves in Western Australia, and you're the CEO of and the senior executives of one of the major global mining companies, you will lose your job. So there's real cost and consequence now in the way there hasn't been in the past. That's much more immediate. On climate, it'll come as a huge surprise to you, but it's real, okay? It's real. July 22nd, 2024 was the hottest day on record. 2024 was the hottest year on record. 11 of the hottest 11 years on record were the last 11 years. The concentration of greenhouse gas heat-containing gases in our atmosphere is the highest level ever in the history of humanity, and beyond, well beyond. This is real. 1.6 degrees temperature last year. That's not a long-run average, which may still be below 1.5 degrees, but forget about hitting 1.5 degrees. Transition has begun. Trump will make it more expensive and make the change more traumatic by virtue of what he will implement with his administration over the next few years. But fundamentally, it's happening. My guess says, talking to climate scientists, we're probably heading towards 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade on the back of existing policies and pace of transition. Challenge you have is the impact of climate on our way of living is not linear. It's exponential. So every 0.1 degree increase is actually massively material in what it means. And the other big thing is it's so complex we just don't know. So as you think about that front, if you're down in Youghal or in West Cork and you got a lovely house on the beach, and you think, south of France, here I come. If we lose the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is a real risk with the melting of the Arctic and particularly the ice on Greenland, then we'll be Newfoundland. So, though I did see one paper that says, on balance, we'll be back where we were because the world will heat up. But the bottom line is we do have, whether it's monsoons, whether it is the massive ocean flows, we have massive uncertainties. And one of the big things is that the short-term impact has been greater than what's predicted, and it's largely down to heat in the water. And so there's real concern in the scientific community about just dealing with much greater impact earlier in that temperature rising than was anticipated even a few years ago. So I used to think, maybe if like 5% of Los Angeles burns down, maybe people might get serious about it. But no, we seem to be immune to these climate events that are increasing in ferocity and impact. 3 months of rain falling in 3 hours is implication in Western Spain or Eastern Spain as an example. We're kind of immune to them, but what we won't be immune to is the financial impact. And John touched on it, and I think insurance is the canary in the coal mine. I'm going to give you the California example. So in California, by virtue of the wildfire risk, there's been increasing, and there's a cap on insurance rates. And so what's happened is that there's been capacity withdrawn from the market. So they implemented a number of years back the thing called the FAIR regime, which is a state-owned scheme. If you can't get insurance from somebody else, you can get it from FAIR. FAIR are more market price, so you see big increases in your premium. Anyway, after Los Angeles, they burned through the few billion of capital they had on their balance sheet, FAIR did. They then ran through about 4 or 5 billion of reinsurance. And on top of that, because they can't go bankrupt, they put a levy out on the general insurance industry in California. So the approved levy, I think, to date has been about just over $1 billion, but there's still an expectation of maybe 3, 4, 5 billion to come in terms of a levy on the general insurance industry. So if you're an insurer and you didn't do basically property insurance, commercial or residential in California, you're still caught on the back end with that levy. So that has massive implications. And by the way, all the carriers in reinsurance have all blown through, most of them blown through their cat risk budget for the year in January. It's normally seen as a Q3 risk from a budget perspective. So these balance sheets are not limitless. Main board director of Allianz within the last week basically came out and said it was a risk to the global capital system. Because as John pointed out, you pull away insurance, you pull away the value of your asset, you pull away ability to raise debt, to trade in assets, buy or sell. So this is the canary in the coal mine. This is real cost. And the governments, back to John's main point, don't have the balance sheets to step in and just keep writing checks to mitigate the impact. And so transition is coming, and as you think about your business, you got to think about your carbon footprint. The good news is renewables are cheap as chips. We just got to get out of our own way with respect to policy and grid and a whole bunch of stuff, because the answer is very simple. It's get ever more out of every unit we put into the economy and society of energy. So efficiency, generally the IR on that is fantastic. 2 is electrify everything we can, because we can decarbonize electricity really cheaply. In India, 2 weeks ago, 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour utility scale solar, with their cost of capital, which is higher than here. And finally, you're going to be left with a bunch of difficult stuff like maritime and aviation, certain industrial process, cement, steel, and there will be new technologies in the mix there. But fundamentally, we have no choice. This has to happen, and it has to happen now. With that, I am going to join Paul on these lovely, comfortable seats. I think he has a couple of questions, and then we might open it up.
Thanks, Jim. Very detailed presentation. A lot to think and go through there. If we start with the States, maybe, you're mentioning Mr. Trump. Is there any constraints to what he can or will do?
The great news is the markets are immune to bullying, immune to DEI policy and other social assaults. The markets are the discipline on him, right? What's had him change policy on tariffs in the space of a few days? It's the market reaction. But the one to focus on, and my partner is a bond trader, so I've got a whole new love of bonds, like John. I came late to it, John, but I got there. The bonds will tell you everything. And that's what scared the living hell out of everybody. Because what should have happened was that bond rates should have gone down on the expectation of the economic decline and ultimately interest rate policy being adjusted to recover. Instead, they increased. A lot in the mix there. There was a lot of hedge fund trades that needed to unwind. They had to sell what was available, and that treasuries tend to be more liquid and ability to sell. But fundamentally, there's a real challenge to the dollar as the global reserve currency. David Merriman was there saying a whole lot of institutions just been onto them, unsolicited, looking to take money out of the US, put it into European asset managers. There's a real big concern about its role and what replaces it. And central banks are gaming this. And the big risk is that if you take a view that the dollar's role is finished as the global reserve currency, then you want to be the first out the door, not the last. And so the real crisis implication here is that a fundamental shift in sentiment sends people for the door, which has very dramatic short-term financial implications. And the implications go way beyond the United States because everything is priced off US Treasuries in the global financial system. So again, I am great crack, by the way. I mean, no, genuinely. No. Like, get me going. Listen, 2 boys through Blackrock College in Dublin. And you know what? They're both Munster rugby supporters, okay? Now, they've no friends, but fuck it, it was worth it, okay? Okay? So I'm great crack, really, okay? But that's the big constraint, is the markets, and there's insider trading, all sorts of other stuff you can be sure going on, but the bottom line is the markets are objective, and they will continue to express their view on the administration. Now, it won't stop him doing what he's doing more generally speaking, around migration, around the assault on civic society, challenge judiciary. But it's really important as well that the judiciary stands up, and the Supreme Court in particular. There's a big decision before them. It's before them as an emergency case. The expectation is that they'll take it as a proper case because it's too important. It's around his executive authority to fire people. And it's all about whether he can fire Jay Powell. That's not before the court. But if he gets the ability to fire the couple of, one's the Labour Board, and I can't remember what the other is, but fire those executives, which are kind of independent agencies, then the fear is he goes after the Fed. And Jay Powell, interesting enough, is up as chair next year. He's not up as a Fed governor for another 2 years. So he could choose to stay down as, so the expectation is he stands down as chair but doesn't come off the Federal Reserve Board. But and by the way, back to the first point, if Trump goes after the Fed, then like really buckle up, because that goes right to the heart of the dollar's your kind of role, let me put it that way, and the objectivity around the central bank or the Federal Reserve. But that decision, it's Trump versus somebody or other, but that's up for decision this quarter, and could be massive. If they give him free rein, then I think you may see a dramatic market reaction just in the back of that. Also, civic society needs to stand up, and lawyers have been rolling over. Typical bloody lawyers. I mean, the accountants are much better, but Harvard stood up last night, first of the big universities. Now this morning, Trump was saying, $2 billion taken away from you, but like civic society needs to stand up as well and challenge the authority. But it's going to be ugly, is the short answer.
You said advantage China. Do you believe that, given that they have more exports at stake in a trade confrontation?
Look, again, the world has changed dramatically. It's not a physical, good traded world anymore, not just a commodity traded world anymore. China, I think 2% of the GDP is exposed to the United States. There'll be pain, you can be assured. But I would say as much pain will be felt in the United States, because the stuff they're importing is not stuff that they don't need. It's air conditioners, it's computers, it's iPhones, it's like you name it. And that's why he backed down over the weekend on some of the tech. But they're in a position, I mean, they are so strategic. It's an authoritarian regime, massively controlled. They can withstand way more pain than Trump can withstand, whether it's driven by the markets or populist or popular sentiment. And they're just going to play the long game. I touched already on the factors that are there. Mao, when he took on the United States and Korea back in the 50s, described them as a paper tiger. It was, in other words, we will win because we'll just be able to stay longer and be able to bear the cost to a much greater extent and greater tenor than the United States. And he was right. And that's the exact same today. And Trump has no clue of that. There's no strategic sense of that. They are looking way beyond Trump because he's only got another 3 years. Xi could be there for another 15, 20 years. And they're focused on Taiwan. This, as I touched on already, this is great news for that. Everyone in Southeast Asia now is like, they're not making their way to, they're making their way to DC just because they have to. They're making their way to Beijing. She's in Vietnam today, or he's coming to them. Bottom line, China's ability to express its influence in its backyard has just gone up by multiples. So yeah, it's advantage China.
Just throw a few questions out to the floor. Has anyone any question for Jim?
Thanks, Jim. When you look at the game of chess as it evolves with Trump, like with Gaza and Ukraine, how do you think that will evolve?
So trying to predict what Trump will or won't do, because is like at one level is a bit of a mug's game. I think Ukraine has to be seen at where Europe has to step up and save Ukraine now. Okay, I think that you got to hope that the U.S. continues to maintain some element of military support, particularly intelligence. But other than that, Europe has to see this as its problem, and it's got to put the resources, as a whole bunch were announced this week, has to put the resources behind Ukraine. But it's but there's just no consistency, okay? And he responds to authoritarians outside of Xi in China. He really embraced them. We had Mr. El Salvador in yesterday, right? I mean, the bottom line is like he just loves that model of governance, which is how we operate in business life, and he instinctively respects it in a way he doesn't respect, fundamental liberal democracy. So from a Ukraine perspective, Europe has to stand up. Was the other Middle East, was it? Oh, yeah. Pick an easy one then, wouldn't you? Look, Israel is dominant, okay? I think there's a number of things there we're going to look back. First of all, I think that's the first real AI war. Within 2 weeks of October 7th, the Israelis had run out of targets, and you can be assured various tech companies and others, I won't mention names in case I get sued, but basically have been providing to create targets and using mobile phone signals, face imagery, a whole bunch of stuff, behaviors. And then they moderated the collateral damage. It used to be 20 civilians for one senior leader of Hamas. It changed to 20 for anyone they thought might be Hamas, to 200 for a senior leader. But that's been a continuum since Grozny in Chechnya, Syria, Ukraine. Look, war has got ugly. Forget about Geneva Conventions. Back to rules-based order. There's no rules-based order. Might is right. So Israel has a phenomenal military system, and they've defeated Hezbollah. They've in practice defeated Hamas. Syria has moved into a new role, but they've now moved into Syria, taking land. The question is, what pressure is there to deal with the fact you've got two people sharing the same plot of land? And I think my gut tells me it's a long, drawn-out, no-end situation. There's no pressure to bring around some functional solution for Palestinians in the general Palestinian area. Trump's idea is just complete nonsense, but ultimately there is zero pressure on Israel to come to any settlement. But for Israel, strategically, it's massively negative in my view, because their influence in the world is much diminished. The Israeli government is a product of the right wing. That's what's holding it there, and so that's why it's so extreme in its policies. Is there a chance in an election, which could be well over a year out yet, that a more moderate Israeli government looks for something more functional? Maybe, but that's about the only thing I think that can bring it about.
Could I ask, will that country club Republican class get control anytime,
No.
do you think?
No.
Dan Mulhall kind of said there's a possibility, but you think not?
No, I just, they lost. They lost over the last 3 years as Trump took control, notwithstanding a whole series of electoral outcomes and stuff that seemed to fly in the face of Trump and his influence. He took control of the Republican machine, and he doesn't control it fully. So you have, for example, and what you'll see in Congress is you'll see some of the classic fiscal conservative Republicans are still there, and that'll feature in the whole tax budget deficit dynamic as it plays out later this quarter. So he doesn't have the full control, but going back to what it was, no time soon. I would expect that, yeah, again, we're into realms of massive speculation here, but there is, even with if there's a Republican loss next November with Senate and House of Representatives, which is not guaranteed, by the way. I think so, but the Democrats are in disarray. But assuming that goes through, and Trump doesn't engineer some, extension, then he will have someone like J.D. Vance up, representing his thinking. And the challenge is, in the primary system, it's the extreme of your party wins, right? Okay, they'll turn out because you only need, kind of 15, 20% of the electorate to rabidly believe you're the person and your policies are right. So the question is there sufficient economic fallout for the United States that ultimately gets at this rabid support for him? But that's the only, and that's going to play out in a number of years, and it'll be messy. So, but there's no quick fix there.
And then, if you were to follow that through, the Financial Times today says Europe really has to choose, and will visibly have to choose, between the US and China. And so, the prognosis that you'd almost be saying is that we should be tilting a little bit more towards China and try to play the middle road. But the reason the Financial Times says that is because they're saying the US will take exception to that, and it will almost push Europe in that direction.
Yeah, so I think Europe would be better off. So Europe hates this position, right? I mean, this is the last thing. Though, interestingly enough, MAGA may be mega, right? Okay, it could make Europe great again, in a sense that these are issues like on defense and security. Europe should have been dealing in its own right. And we do have this massive free market. And we do have an ability to engage with other economic groupings to continue to push globalization. But it's being compelled now to take a much more constructive approach to China than it might otherwise do. I don't think, it's a bit like Ireland between the EU and the United States, I wouldn't pick sides. I'd be kind of trying to fudge it, okay? In the same way, I think Europe needs to stand up to the United States, but do that in a very smart way, because ultimately, I mean, the challenge is Trump will just think he just doesn't like Europe and will think he ultimately is stronger and can bully. So you'll really need to be smart to target weak spots in his ecosystem to kind of stand up. But I think in the mix there, you don't overtly go towards China, but you definitely constructively engage with China. And I don't think that in any way will make it worse for Europe versus the United States, because I think it's just bad. It's a bit like the tariff comment that Brendan made, you know what I mean? Above 50%, who cares? It's a bit like, he hates us anyway. Is he going to hate us that much more? Does it really make a difference, right? And but Europe is going to engage more constructively with China than it would have in other circumstances, no question.
Jim, sorry, just on that then, no mention of Russia in this so far, and obviously we're in a pincer movement in Europe between Russia, China on the one side and the US on the other side. Will Russia have a feature in this at all in the next couple of years?
So of course it does, because there's kinetic activity on the eastern borders of Europe, okay, which is massively negative, its implications. But the Ukrainians are fighting our fight, okay? I don't buy that Russia will be heading into Estonia immediately afterwards. It's a completely different exercise for the Russian army to take on, kind of the European military, even without US support, okay? There's just a different level of training, different level of sophistication, different level of weaponry at its disposal. Do I see Russia continue trying to use, kind of other elements of warfare, intelligence, system, IT, AI-based? Absolutely. So Russia is a threat, but Russia is a declining entity. It's commodity-based, it's a plutocracy, and so as you think about the strategic game, it has some relevance, but it's not a dictator of events. However, Europe has to stand up, has to support Ukraine economically, has to support it militarily, in a way that kind of at least maintains the status quo. Because I think that's the best you can hope for in a world where the United States is so pro-Russia. So no would be the short answer, right? However, but let me make some observation about Trump. So first of all, he is unbelievably politically intelligent in terms of understanding what people want to hear and communicating in simple, typically incorrect terms, but in a way that makes them happy and that he has their back. And in a sense, he couldn't have done this 15 years ago, or 20 years ago. It's a moment, and it's tied into social media and a whole bunch of other dimensions as well. But fundamentally, you have to respect that. Now, the fact he'll do nothing for that constituency, and probably even worse than nothing, it would be extraordinarily damaging, is an irrelevance. And they won't give up that easily, right? Okay, I mean, you still can't have a really rational conversation in the UK about Brexit, okay? And the last thing that will work is the Democrats saying, "We told you so." But I think you've got to give him that. The other thing I would say to him is he is picking up on things that were wrong. Europe and security was wrong. Public sector effective. Like he's picking on things, going about it the wrong way. The volume control is way off the meter. But fundamentally, he's picked on things and called out things that needed to be called out at some level, and so you've got to respect that too. But fundamentally, there's an administration in place that's taking down the global world order, and there's nothing good about that. Nothing.
Finally, Jim, for the Irish SME in the room, what's your advice in the medium term?
No, I think, look, I said it from the podium, I would be very cautious now. This is a time to really think about your resilience as a business, understand your economic vulnerabilities, scenario test, a downturn in business, understand what your supply chain implications, those you have in particular manufacturing businesses, what that means. But ultimately, this is not the time for growth and expansion. This is a time for pulling the horns in and just thinking far more conservatively about kind of how you deploy your cash. Don't lose sight of climate and sustainability. It's a real thing, hasn't gone away. But think about it with that risk framework rather than any sort of value-based judgment about what's right or wrong. And look, I mean, AI was touched on. I mean, there's so many things we could talk about, but although I was at something yesterday in London, apparently AI can have catastrophic forgetting. And now I have that with Paul. I have it the morning after, and I have it with Paul, but apparently AI can have catastrophic forgetting. So it's not good with changing dynamics. It can learn to do something, but if it then goes on to do something else, it forgets. So in the same way there was a lot of greenwashing in the day, and may still be, there's a lot of AI washing going on as well. A lot of conventional algorithm stuff, etc., all getting AI washed. But it is very real. We were talking earlier, those young data scientists coming out are out of a job because AI does it in like seconds. The challenge is we need them to get some experience. So there's challenges in the mix with AI, but it is material, massively material, particularly where there's massive amounts of data needs to be simulated in a whole load of different ways, which will affect everything at the end of the day. But anyway, but look, I mean, generally speaking, it's just a different world. But we'll adapt, we'll succeed and fail in a new context. But you have to understand the world has changed.
Ladies and gentlemen, can show your appreciation for Jim Barry. Thank you.